Hey everyone, this is Anthony with Bad Dog Creative. I'm really excited to bring you this project. This is the first video in a 6-part series where I build 5 pieces of furniture totaling over $11,000. So I'll be building this entire table out of solid white ash. While I start to lay out the timbers for the tabletop, I'll tell you a little bit about how I got this project. I had posted for sale on Facebook a table that I built out of pallets. Well, someone from a local church here in Washington had seen the post and reached out to me to see if they could hire me to build them a table. As we started talking through the details and pricing, they asked me for quotes for other pieces that they wanted and ended up hiring me to build not 1, but 5 pieces of furniture. Here's a glimpse at some of the design options we looked at. I 3D modeled these in Revit for those of you that are wondering. We'll look closer at these designs later. I'll also mention that I had just started my own construction business about 3 or 4 months prior, so this was not a side hustle. This was part of my full-time income, and I needed the money from this project to pay my bills. I will discuss all of my costs and reveal exactly how much I made on this project in the last video of the series. Now, after staring at these slabs for literally days, trying every single possible layout I could imagine, I finally had the confidence to start cutting into them. I'm really not joking. It took me a few days to make a decision as to how I would lay out the boards for the tabletop. I'm sure your grandpa taught you how to measure once and cut 3 times, but in this case, I'm going to measure 10 times and cut 1 time, because I paid a few $100s for these timbers, and they've been acclimating to the humidity in my garage for about a month, so I don't want to mess this up. Before I plane these to thickness, I want to show you how you can see one of these boards is cupped in the opposite direction of the ring growth patterns. This will be very important later when we do our glue up, but just take note of that for now. This process of milling my rough sawn timbers in my planer, jointer, drum sander, and table saw took me about an entire day. Now, say what you want about my manhood, but pushing these big timbers through all these machines, especially the joiner, takes quite a lot of effort. Here is before the milling, and here is after. Notice how the growth rings are facing up in the middle 2 boards and down on the end 2 boards. Alternating the orientation of the boards is one technique used to help mitigate cupping in the final slab. Now let's get ready to glue these up. But first, we have to drill some dowels. So I got this doweling jig, thankfully from my dad. You can probably find one in your grandpa's wood shop, or even at a garage sale. If you don't feel like looking for one, you could buy a new one on Amazon using the affiliate link in the description. I make a small commission if you make a purchase after following one of those links at no added cost to you. Thank you so much to anyone who's done so already. I did cut my own dowels for this, including a little slot to allow the excess glue to purge out and not create a vacuum that would push the dowel out of its hole. What do you think? Did I use too many dowels, or is this just the perfect amount? I did a dry run with no glue to ensure that all the dowels aligned perfectly as they should. If one of the dowels was misaligned, I would either just omit that dowel or ream the hole slightly larger. One misaligned dowel could prevent the joint from closing tight, which would be an absolute disaster if this was covered in glue and clamped 90% of the way closed. It would be nearly impossible to pry them apart at that point without damaging the boards. As you watch me glue and clamp these together, I want to point out 3 very important things. The first thing, which you've probably already noticed, is that the dowels are staggered. This will help prevent the boards from rolling as I add clamping pressure. The second thing is that the dowels are located so they're about a 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch from the edge of the timbers. I want to ensure that I have plenty of space between the edge of that dowel and the face of the table because I'll plane this down to its final thickness after the glue up. The third thing you'll notice is that I'm going to glue this together in 3 separate stages. I could be wrong about this, but I was afraid that if I tried to glue up all 4 pieces together at the same time, I would be at risk of one of the joints not closing all the way. So to mitigate this risk, I glued these up in 3 separate stages, with the 2 ends being first and then the final seam down the middle. Now I will set this slab aside and get ready to build the base. But before I do that, I need to do something really important for my client to help them make some decisions. So my client has not yet made a decision on what type of finish they want to use. Now, normally this would be something I'd want to know going into a project, but this project was for a community church, so decision making was naturally pretty slow. So I created a bunch of samples to show some different finish options, as well as different edge profiles we could use on the tabletops. These samples were for all 5 of the pieces I'll be building for them. So if you were wondering which one I'd be using on this table, well, the answer is none of these. They actually picked a different sample that I created off camera. In my experience, I found that this is a necessary step on higher ticket pieces. Not every detail can be captured or understood in the drawings. Taking just a little bit of extra time to do this not only helps speed up the decision-making process, but it also steps up the level of service for my customers, and it helps lower my risk, so I know that my client is very clear on exactly what will be delivered. Okay, I really need to start work on the table base now. But first, I have to fix a flaw in the tabletop so I can get it off my workbench. So unfortunately, there was a knot hole in one of the timbers that I just couldn't avoid. Thankfully, this was only on the bottom of the table. I know in some cases, people would want to put this on the top and actually expose it, but this project calls for a little bit of a cleaner look. Anyway, I want to fill this void up with some epoxy and get it curing so I can plane this thing down in about a week. There's links in the description for both the epoxy and the black mica powder that I'm using. I mix this thoroughly for about 5 minutes and then get to pouring. I'm going to apologize for the out of focus shot here, but look how much epoxy this little tiny knot hole drinks up. I use a little poker to vibrate the epoxy down into the hole and make sure there's no air pockets trapped inside. Oh, and don't make fun of my use of a Bic to pop the air bubbles. I left my torch on a job site. While that epoxy's curing up, let's actually get started on the table base. So the first step in starting the base is milling all of my rough timbers down to size. This part of the process is kind of boring and repetitive, so I won't show all of it, but basically I just walk back and forth from either end of the drum sander for about 4 hours until all of my parts are down to the desired thickness. After cutting all the parts to size, I start to lay out some mortise and tenons. These parts I'm making right here are actually for a decorative panel that will go between the 2 front legs. This will also act as lateral support to help stabilize the table horizontally. This will make more sense in a few minutes, but let me show you my favorite way to create tenons. Basically, I set a stop block on my table saw sled, run a series of cuts, I break off the pieces, which by the way is super satisfying to do. Now I'll run my part back through the table saw, but perpendicular to the direction of the blade, which will shave off all of the rough edges. This step is also super satisfying because you're left with a perfect tenon. Now, I need a tenon on both ends of this piece, so to make this part really accurate, I want to measure it from the base of the tenon to the base of the other tenon. So I'll slip a tiny stop block that fits just underneath the tenon I already created. This allows me to create duplicate parts in a very accurate way and will ensure that when I go to assemble this, everything will go together square and parallel super easy. So that's pretty much my favorite way to create tenons. Next, I want to lay out the tenons on the part still attached to. I quickly noticed these were really close to the end of the other part. So I decided to shrink the size of these tenons to help prevent any blowout when I glue these together. To prevent any minuscule changes in the size of this overall part, I set my blade just a little bit smaller and then shaved off what was left over with my chisel. Then I lay out the final location of these tenons and I carve out the mortises using my router. In a few weeks, I'll post a video showing how I made this mortising jig. So make sure to subscribe if you're not already so you don't miss out on that one. Now I'm left with the decision to either square off the corners of the mortise with a chisel, but I think rounding off the corners of the tenons is a lot quicker, not to mention a heck of a lot more fun to do. Now I will cut all of the tenons to their exact length. I'll do a quick dry fit and then get ready to glue this together. The glue up for the decorative panel was pretty straightforward. I just glue and assemble all my parts. I check it for square, and then with a straight edge on each end, I clamp it at each of the joint locations. Now while that dries overnight, I'll build my footrail and legs. So for the foot rail and legs, I did exactly the same steps to create my mortise and tenons, just a little bit larger this time. And then I made a really stupid mistake. While my router was winding down, I stupidly set it down on top of my parts, cutting this gouge into one of the legs. I was really bummed out when this happened because it was late in the day and I was just about to glue these parts together, so I called it a night and came back to try to fix this tomorrow. So after sleeping on it, I decided that it would make the most sense to sand all of my parts down about 1/8 of an inch to cover up this blemish. The other option would have been to trash that leg and create a new one, but I decided that the small amount I had to take off wouldn't have a visual impact when comparing the final piece to the drawings. Okay, now that I've fixed my mistake, I'm going to locate the center of the post and then route a small chamfer in the bottom edge. This has little visual impact, but I believe will help with the longevity of this piece. In case somebody is moving this in the future, chamfering this corner will help prevent the leg from chipping. Finally, I'll drill 2 holes. Starting with the 1-inch spade bit, I'll go down about 1/2 inch. Then with another drill bit, I'll finish this off, which will allow my barrel nut for the leveling feet to sit perfectly in the leg. Alright, I'm so close to assembling the base now. I'm going to drill some dowels in the legs and the decorative panels so I can attach them together. I like to pre-sand my parts to make it easier after assembly. First, I orbital the surface up to 220 grit, and then I break the corners by hand. And finally, I can glue some parts together. Now, I'll glue up this base in 2 stages over the course of 2 days. I did this because there's a handful of small parts that go together to create this base. In doing this in separate phases, it allows me to better control whether things come out square and parallel. So, what you see me doing here is attaching the foot rail support to the 2 side legs, and then I take a scrap block of wood that is exactly the same dimension as the foot rail support, and I clamp it at the opposite end to ensure that the legs are parallel. Then I just clean up any excess glue. I do this again for the other side, and I let this dry overnight. Now at this point, I am like really stoked. The base is finally at a stage where it's starting to look like something I could put a tabletop on. So today my goal is to get the whole base finally assembled. Once I have that done, I can set it aside to dry and get back to work on surfacing and finishing the tabletop. The final assembly day went pretty smooth and easy. Thankfully, I measured everything super precisely and accurately, so I had no problem getting everything square and parallel. After clamping it all together, I set some heavy timbers on top of it and placed the base in a place in my garage where I know the floor is super flat. Alright, now that the base is assembled, I need to get to work on surfacing and preparing my top slab for finishing. Make no mistake, this was by far the hardest part of this entire project. This part not only took the longest, but that slab was pretty heavy. I estimate it was about 120 pounds, and I think it took me about 60 to 75 passes to get this thing down to a point where I was happy with it. This is the actual speed the slab proceeds through the drum sander, not sped up. So yeah, the point is, this step took quite a long time. It was about a day and a half just doing this over and over and over again. I eventually used my brain and built a dolly out of a scrap piece of plywood and some casters. Oh, and I also made this simple little infeed table. I know a lot of other woodworkers will say that a drum sander isn't the best tool for this job. And the truth is, this might not be the best method for surfacing slabs. Using a router sled or bringing this thing in to somebody with the wide belt will probably get it done much faster. But I had just purchased this machine specifically for this job, so I was pretty eager to try surfacing a slab in it. Although it was really slow, once I had the slab properly supported and I got the speed and depth settings dialed on the sander, it went really well, and I got a really great result out of this machine. There's just a little bit of burning at the ends, but that's okay because I left this much longer than I actually need it. Which brings up the next step in this process. I have to trim this slab to its final size. Now, this might seem like a simple task, just cutting a straight line along a piece of wood, but it's about 3 inches thick. So it's too deep to get through the table saw, and yes, I could flip the slab and hit it on both sides, but it's also really large and heavy, and the table saw just felt like not the right move. Then I thought about maxing out my circular saw and doing that on both sides, but this felt like it wouldn't give me a good result. In the end, I decided that I could buy a super long straight bit for my router and just use that to trim this to size. This worked really well, and I found that it gave me a great result with little to no burning, and of course no saw blade marks to have to sand out later. I just made sure to go really slow and clear out all the dust in between passes, and this gave me a near perfect result. So yeah, I would highly recommend this method if you need to cut a large slab and you don't have access to a giant table saw. Now for my personal favorite part of every single project, which is routing the edge profile into the tabletop. Usually at this point in a project, I've spent many hours or days on the project, so this is a very exciting step. It's one of the finishing touches that brings the piece together and is something that the people who will use it will actually touch and feel. Because of this, it's also one of the highest risk tasks I have to do on this whole project. One wrong move with that router could take a chunk or a divot out of this table and would erase hours and days of work on this slab. So yeah, this step requires intense focus and concentration and a clear mind. What are your thoughts on the double chamfer profile my clients chose? Personally, I think it helps make this super thick top feel just a little bit lighter. Now I have to come up with a way to attach the top to the base. And the method I decided to use might surprise you. So I'm sure you've seen these U-channel stiffeners in other YouTubers' videos. This is just a prefabricated steel channel with slotted holes, and it's powder coated that can be used to stiffen tabletop slabs. I'm going to make this part do double duty in that it's going to help me attach the top to the base and stiffen my slab. This will all make more sense in a few minutes, but for now, let's drill some holes and put in some threaded inserts. There's affiliate links in the description for the threaded inserts, bolts, and the steel U-channel if you're interested to buy the same ones that I'm using here. These go in pretty easy with an Allen wrench that's provided. I added just a little bit of CA glue for a little bit of extra insurance, and then I screw them in till they're down flush. Finally, I give it a quick test fit, and I get ready to route some grooves into the bottom of the tabletop. Using my router, I'm going to recess a groove, square off the corners with my chisel, and then cut a slot which will accept the leg on the C-channel. Then I'll just ease these sharp corners with my chisel so the C-channel sits in there more tightly. Now I'll mark and drill the location of my threaded inserts. Once I screw these in, there's only one final task left to do until we're ready to sand and finish. I need to cut a super small slot in the wood that will accept the head of the bolt and the washer. So I mark out the location, and then since this won't be seen, I freehand this out with the router. Okay, the literal last step in this entire process is sanding and finishing the table. Okay, so in this video, I'm actually not going to show every step of the finishing process. I will be releasing another video that explains my entire finishing process for all of the pieces of the furniture in this project. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that one. What I will tell you now is that I used 3 different products on the tops, including a water-based finish that my client selected from the samples. Once the finishing is complete, all there's left to do is to hammer in the barrel nuts and screw in the leveling feet. Then I place the top onto the U-channels, which are screwed into the legs. Then with the helping hand from my wife, I drop this thing into place, I screw it on, and this thing's ready to deliver. Drop me a comment as to what your favorite wood species is, so I know you made it to the end of the video. And also, let me know, what do you think of this build? Here's a shot of it in its final place. I'll see you in the next one.